to start our today's lecture. Matthew, may I invite you to join us now? Thanks a lot. Dear students, dear colleagues, today we have actually a very special lecture, I would say. First of all, I would like to thank Embassy of United States of America to Latvia for this opportunity and for inviting Professor Kroenig to give this lecture. And this lecture will be the beginning of, I would say, chain of different events which are part of celebration of 100 years diplomatic relations between Latvia and United States. I would like to remind that in July 28th, at 1922, the first envoy of USA to Latvia was the one who sends a special message to our new established country about recognition. And of course, I just have to mention that United States has never accepted the occupation of USSR here in Latvia and has always supported our independence. And for this reason, there is no wonder that President George Washington Bush was the one who supported us a lot after re-establishing our independence in 1991. And it means also that we are celebrating also kind of restoration of our relations. One more special time for diplomatic relations of our countries. And I really believe that this is not only one event which will be visible not only for students but for wider audience here in Latvia. But as I said today, thanks to Professor Kroenig, who agreed to give lecture on Friday, which is, I believe, a bit challenging for Professor himself. But at first, I would like to introduce you with Professor. He is Deputy Director for Strategy, at Schofford Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, and a professor at Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. His areas of expertise include U.S. foreign policy, great power competition between China and Russia, emerging technologies, with China and Russia, emerging technologies and strategic deterrence and weapons of non-proliferation. Also, Professor has served in several positions in the U.S. Department of Defense and in the community. And today we will have a great chance to hear the lecture focusing on great power rivalry, which is especially emerging issue during these days. Students, please take a chance to ask the questions. You will have a possibility to ask them either via chat option or after the introduction of Professor Kroenig. Then I will give floor to you, and you will have a chance to speak yourself as well. So now, Professor, please, floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Professor, and thank you for hosting me today. Thanks also to the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Embassy in Riga. And thanks to all of you for joining on a Friday evening. I know you probably have many other things to do, so I'm really honored that you decided to spend your time with me. So we're talking about the return of great power rivalry today with the focus on the Russian challenge. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot over the past few years. I published a book on great power rivalry 2 years ago and been doing a lot of work on the policy and strategy for great power rivalry at the Atlantic Council. And one interesting news item, the Russian government has apparently noticed my work because last week they sanctioned 29 Americans, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, and many other important people, and then me, for some reason. I was on the list. So I don't know what I did that got their attention, but I'm glad somebody noticed my work. So I did prepare some slides for this lecture, so let me go ahead and pull those up. Return of great power rivalry and countering Russian influence, but we'll talk about China as well because they're increasingly working together. So here's a copy of my book from a couple of years ago if you're interested in reading more. And this theme, democracy versus autocracy, is an important one. Biden, some people have said this is Biden's foreign policy doctrine, that we're at an inflection point, that the world is increasingly divided with democracies on one side and autocracies on the other. But can democracies still deliver for their people? And central argument of this book is that I believe that they can and consistently outperform autocracies. So here's what I want to do over the next 30 minutes or so, just talk a little bit about the theoretical and historical background for this rivalry, talk about the challenge from Russia, the challenge from China, and then what should the United States and its allies like Latvia do about it. As you all know, great power rivalry, great power competition is nothing new. From the beginning of recorded human history, we have rivalries among the major powers. And so I focus on 7 rivalries in my book, and in each case it's a democracy against an autocracy. And I start with the Greeks against the Persians 2,500 years ago, and then go all the way up through the Cold War. And do find that democracies do pretty well in these rivalries. Now, we did have this really remarkable period after the end of the Cold War, this 25-year period where, at least in the West, many of us thought that great power rivalry was over. And it's hard to believe now, but if you go back to the 2010 National Security Strategy of the United States, published in the Obama administration, Russia and China are mentioned, but only as possible partners for cooperation. They're never mentioned as possible threats. And that was the widely shared assessment at the time. So the world has really changed over the past past decade. And in this past 25 years, I think the U.S. strategy, the Western strategy, was really optimistic that Russia and China could become responsible stakeholders in a rules-based international system, that we would engage with them, that as they became wealthier, they would become more democratic. As they became more democratic, they'd become more cooperative internationally. But unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. Over the past decade, Russia and China have both become more assertive, threatening their neighbors. And so the United States realized, and our allies realized, okay, this strategy of trying to engage isn't working. We need a tougher approach. And so in the 2017 National Security Strategy of the United States declared the return of great power competition with Russia and China as the foremost challenge to our security. Same in the 2018 National Defense Strategy. And the Biden administration has continued with this focus, saying that China is the greatest state-based threat, and that over the long term, and that Russia, of course, is the acute threat, the near-term threat, and especially with the ongoing war in Ukraine. Okay, so I think there are a lot of people who are pessimistic about our chances. You'll often hear people say, well, these dictators, they can be ruthless, they can have long-term plans, they can take bold action. Meanwhile, in democracies, we're fragmented, we're polarized, we're thinking about the next election in 2 years, not about a long-term strategy. And so this is why I decided to write my book and examine over the past 2,500 years, can democracy deliver? Do democracies or autocracies have the advantage in long-run rivalries? And I find that actually democracies do pretty well in these rivalries, and that we do have many underlying strengths. Economically, democracies are more innovative economically. They become financial centers because people trust investing their money in democracies. And we see that right now with Russia. Where did the Russian oligarchs, where did Putin put their wealth? They don't put it in Russia because they know it's not a system conducive to that. Instead, they're investing in yachts and bank accounts and properties in the United States and London, in Switzerland and elsewhere. Diplomatic advantages, democracies tend to be really good at building alliances and partnerships. And you see that going back in time, and I think we see it pretty clearly today. And the Western unity, I think, is really remarkable, responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The United States, Latvia, are other formal democratic allies in NATO, and then the US allies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia. Together, we make up almost 60% of global GDP. So working together, democracies are still in a really strong position, and I think have the preponderance of power to determine global outcomes. And then military advantages, and there are many of them, but I think the biggest one is, first we're seeing some of the downsides of a dictator's army currently in Ukraine. The Russian soldiers, many of them don't have morale to fight. The equipment isn't working as expected. The decision to invade at all was probably a mistake. And these are some of the weaknesses dictators have. The biggest weakness they have, though, is that they fear their own people more than the enemy. In democracies, we can actually design militaries to focus on external enemies. Russia and China spend more money on internal security to repress their own people than they spend on their militaries. This book and the findings give me some reason for optimism. I think democracies really do have enduring strengths. So what is the challenge then that Russia and China pose? And we'll start with Russia. I think it's helpful to think about what is Russia trying to accomplish. You need to understand the adversary to develop a strategy for it. And I think Putin's first goal is regime survival. I think he is threatened by the spread of democracy. I think he's worried that Russia, if a democratic movement comes to Russia, he'd be out of a job, maybe killed in the streets. So I think that's his first goal, to maintain his dictatorial system. Second, I think Russia wants to reestablish the Russian Empire, reestablish an uncontested sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And this is what Russia demanded, if you'll recall, before invading Ukraine, essentially to roll back the expansion of NATO and give Russia a sphere of influence. And now he's using military force to try to reestablish that empire in Ukraine. Third, I think Putin and Russia want to be seen as a major power. They want to have a seat at the table for every major global security issue, from Iran, Afghanistan, North Korea, and others. Okay, so what is the challenge that Russia poses? Well, it doesn't pose much of an economic challenge, and this is really very different from China, as we'll see in a few moments. Russia has less than 2% of global GDP, so its economy is smaller than Spain's, smaller than Italy's. We don't think of Spain and Italy as great powers, and we shouldn't. So Russia is really not a great power when it comes to its economy. And it has these corrupt economic institutions with Putin and other elites basically stealing from the Russian people. Where Russia does have some economic power is through its natural resource exports and pipeline politics. And we're seeing that now with many European countries dependent on Russian oil and gas exports. And so we're really in this paradoxical situation where European countries are paying hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to Russia for it to fund its war machine as it invades Ukraine. So we'll talk about that challenge and how to address it a little bit later. Politically, Russia doesn't have a large alliance system and it makes a pretty bad ally. You know, in fact, if you look over history, Russia has invaded its allies maybe as much as its enemies. It had an alliance with Nazi Germany during World War II, and then they fought a war with each other. It formed the Warsaw Pact alliance, and then Russia invaded two of its allies, Czechoslovakia and Hungary. It had an alliance with China during the Cold War, and then they fought a border war in 1969. And then Russia established this Commonwealth of Independent States, and now it's invaded two of those countries, Georgia and Ukraine. So Russia is not very good at building alliances. It is more effective, though, at weakening us with disinformation, election interference. And I know you feel that in Latvia. We feel it in the United States with the 2016 election interference, of course, being the most prominent example. And so Russia knows that when we're united within our countries and when the alliance is united, that we're strong. And so they're trying to divide us and turn us against each other. Russia established itself as a major power in the Middle East for the first time since the 1970s with its military intervention into Syria. And then around the world, Putin is supporting anti-American dictators like in Venezuela. And then I do worry that these revisionist autocracies, Russia, China, and Iran, are working more closely together. They've engaged in joint military exercises, joint weapons production. And so I think the free world is more unified, but I also think these revisionist dictators are becoming more unified. And this is, I think Biden is right, that this is one of the major cleavages in international politics in the global order today. Military, we're seeing the Russian military threat currently. Russia does have what I think is a pretty sophisticated military strategy. That they call it new generation warfare, but essentially the idea is integrating all elements of national power down from the level of information operations all the way up to nuclear war. You know, we see the information operations going on in Ukraine and in our societies on almost a daily basis. We see the military invasion of Ukraine and the nuclear threats. And Putin and Lavrov and other Russian officials are making these nuclear threats frequently. And I do think there is a risk of nuclear weapons use in Ukraine. I don't think it's high, but I think that it is possible that Russia could use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Russia's invested a lot in its military modernization. Again, we're seeing the limits of that now, but it's still dangerous. Many people are dying in Ukraine. You know, Latvia is a small country. I was talking to Estonia, a friend in Estonia, another your small neighbor, who said, you know, Putin hasn't taken all of Ukraine, but he's basically taken, you know, at least one Estonia worth of territory with the territory he has taken in Ukraine. You know, Putin does have this habit of invading his neighbors, Georgia, Ukraine, military interventions also in Kazakhstan, Belarus. So this is a real military threat, and not just to the eastern flank of NATO, but I think to the United States as well. So this is a real challenge. But let's talk about the threat from China. And as I said, in the United States, we see Russia as the acute near-term threat, but we see China as the greater long-term threat, largely because of its economic potential. You know, Russia's only 2% of global GDP. China's 15, 16, 17% of global GDP. And some economists project that it could overtake the United States as the world's largest economy within a decade. Now, I'm skeptical of that. I think China has real problems. I don't think it will become the world's leading economic power, but it does have a lot of economic potential. So China's goals are first to become the most dominant state in Asia. They want to push the United States out, break up America's alliances. And then by 2049, the 100th year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, their goal is to become the leading global superpower. And you just need to read Xi Jinping's writings to understand. It's not, they're not keeping it a secret. So the Chinese economic challenge is, as I said, more significant than Russia's. Second largest economy on earth, could become the world's largest economy. Part of the way China has become wealthy is through unfair trade practices. So it really preys on the global economic system, cheats, steals intellectual property from the West, subsidizes its firms, forces Western firms that do business in China to transfer technology. So these are all practices that are inconsistent with WTO standards. For 25 years after the end of the Cold War, we knew this was going on, but we essentially ignored it because we hoped that, again, we had this engagement strategy. But now that we're following this competition strategy, we're no longer willing to ignore these practices. And so we'll talk about how to address those, because I do think this requires the United States, Latvia, and our other democratic partners to work together. China also plans to dominate technology of the 21st century. The Western democracies have essentially been the world's technology leaders going back to the Industrial Revolution. China wants to change that. They have this massive state-led plan to dominate artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonic missiles, other new technologies. And so if they succeed in that new tech race, then China will get the economic, geopolitical, and military advantages that come with that, to the detriment of our security. Also, I think they'll design this technology in a way that builds in the preferences of dictators, that'll make it easier to spy on people. And so I think this is a challenge that democracies need to win this tech race to maintain our advantages, but also so that we can have artificial intelligence and other technologies that are consistent with democratic norms. China is also making major infrastructure investments with its Belt and Road Initiative, gaining geopolitical influence in every region of the world, including in Europe and the Americas. And then as countries become economically dependent on China, China uses it to its advantages and engages in economic coercion. It's doing that right now to your neighbor, Lithuania, but has also done it against Australia, South Korea, and other countries. So it goes to show the dangers of becoming too dependent on China economically. Politically, China is also a challenge. It's engaging in genocide against the Uyghur minority in China, so it doesn't share our values. It's also exporting its model of authoritarianism overseas. China has developed this facial recognition technology to track all of its citizens, and now it's exporting that technology to other dictators. I already mentioned how China uses its economic power to coerce countries. And then like Russia, China is also using tactics to interfere in democracies and turn our openness against us. And there are many examples of this. They were paying off an Australian politician to adopt pro-China policies. They were paying off an international relations professor in the Czech Republic to say nice things about China. Many other examples. And then competitive multilateralism. China is using its influence in international institutions to essentially turn those institutions against their intended purpose. So a good example is the World Health Organization, where China has prevented the World Health Organization from conducting an effective investigation into COVID-19. And of course, if we don't know where COVID-19 started, how it started, it's going to be much harder to prevent a new outbreak. And then China also poses a serious military challenge. So it has border and maritime disputes with almost all of its neighbors, with India, with Vietnam, with Russia, with Japan. So these are all possible flashpoints for conflict. And it's also pursuing a pretty sophisticated military strategy that's been referred to as anti-access area denial strategy. But basically, the idea is to have a bunch of missiles and submarines and other capabilities to destroy US bases in Asia destroy major US military platforms like aircraft carriers in the early stages of a war so that it has a freer hand to invade Taiwan or other neighbors. It's making major military investments, including in nuclear weapons. The Pentagon estimates that China's nuclear arsenal will quadruple within the next decade. So it'll be a near-peer nuclear superpower, like Russia or the United States within a decade. It's also working on projecting its military power more broadly, including in Europe. And China has conducted military exercises with Russia in the Baltic Sea and on Russian territory. So there are many possible flashpoints for conflict, but the one the Pentagon worries about most is Taiwan. And there are really a lot of similarities between Ukraine and Taiwan that make some people worry that Taiwan could be next. Russia is a problem on its own. China is a problem on its own. Unfortunately, they're working more closely together, as I mentioned, with them releasing the statement before Ukraine that says that their alliance has no limits. And so it's hard enough to deal with Russia and Ukraine right now. What if China decides to attack Taiwan at the same time? Or if China attacks Taiwan and Russia thinks that it can get away with more in Europe? So I think this is really the big strategic challenge facing the United States and its democratic allies and Latvia right now. How can we deal with Russia and China at the same time? So this is a daunting challenge. Just a few reasons for optimism. As I said, we do have strengths as democracies. And I think we actually have the advantage in the balance of power as well. So here's a figure showing share of global GDP. The United States still has about a quarter of global GDP. China, depending on how you measure, 15, 16, 17%. But the United States and our NATO allies and our allies in Asia, as I mentioned before, have almost 60% of global GDP compared to Russia and China's 17, 19% of global GDP. So if we work together, we are in a strong position and I think can defend our interests. So what should the strategy look like? How should we be dealing with Russia and China at the same time? I think the first question for any good strategy is what is the goal? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And so this has become a hobby of mine over the past few years, asking senior officials in the United States and Europe, what are we trying to achieve? And I think the clear goal hasn't been articulated yet. I've heard some officials say, well, competition is a part of life. We're just going to have to compete. There's always been competition. In a sense, that's true, but I don't think that should be the goal. I don't think we want to have a competition with Russia where Russia is threatening to invade or actively invading its neighbors. I don't think we want that to go on forever. Others have said, well, the goal is to avoid war. But even if we avoid war, there's a lot of other bad stuff that can happen. What if Russia or China peacefully take over their neighbors or establish a sphere of influence? Spread autocracy, coerce their neighbors. So that's, I think, not a sufficient goal either, just to avoid war. So what I argue is that I think really long term, what we do want, I think we do want a cooperative relationship with Russia or China. I just don't think that's going to be possible anytime soon. Certainly not with Putin in power, certainly not with Xi in power. And it may even take decades. The last major power competition, the Cold War, took 50 years. And we're just really in the early stages of this new era of great power competition. So this might last decades, but I hope that at the end of it, we can get to a place where we do have more cooperative relations. So how do we get there? What's the logic of the strategy? And I would argue what we really need to do is compete now and make it clear to the Russians, clear to the Chinese that the competing with the free world is too difficult, too costly, not good for Moscow, not good for Beijing. And I don't think we can teach Putin that lesson, but maybe the next generation of Russian leaders and Chinese leaders, or maybe 2 generations from now, they'll look back and say, you know what, Putin's approach didn't work. It didn't work for Moscow. We need to try a more cooperative strategy. So how can we do that? And I think there are several different dimensions of this competition. First, economic competition. I think what we need to do here is to selectively decouple our economies from Russia and China. So we're seeing very clearly right now the downside of being dependent on Russia economically. So we're trying to decouple, trying to buy oil and gas from other places. It would have been much better to do this carefully over many years than have to wait for the invasion. And so I think this should be a lesson about how we deal with China. We don't want to wait for China to invade Taiwan and then say, okay, we need to cut off economic ties with China. I think we should start doing that carefully now, but in a selective way. So in areas where there are sensitive national security and technology issues at stake, I think we do need a hard decoupling. But I think there are other areas, agriculture, buying furniture or toys from China, where it's probably fine for trade to continue. It doesn't present a national security risk as long as we're not too vulnerable and we have diversified economic relationships. Technology, this is important. As I said, who's going to win the tech arms race of the 21st century? Is it going to be the free world or is it going to be China? So some have called for a democratic technology alliance. I'm actually working on a report on this right now. I think the free world should come together to maintain our technology advantage, joint research and development projects, information sharing, joint investments. And then we also need to come together to prevent China from stealing technology from us. If China can steal our intellectual property, it gets an unfair advantage. And so there are a lot of ways to do that with export controls, foreign investment screening mechanisms, and other things, but we need to do it together. If only the United States does it, then China can continue to go to Europe and Japan and find the technology. Politically, we have the Russian and Chinese interference in our political systems, and so we need to be resilient against that, share best practices. One of the best ways to counter Russian disinformation, for example, is just to make sure that we do have a vibrant media environment, invest in real journalism. The United States is spending more in Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty to get accurate information to people. And then I was in, I meant to mention this at the beginning of the lecture. I think I forgot. I was just in Latvia in September, so it was great to be there. I was there because I was in Lithuania for work and doing some meetings in Lithuania and rented a car for the weekend and drove to Riga and had a nice weekend. So I wish I could be there with you in person, hope to be back in person sometime soon. But one of the things I learned in Lithuania was they have a disinformation office in government. And so essentially they spot Russian disinformation and propaganda. The government publishes it. Explains what's true and what's false. Journalists can therefore go to this office to get information. So the United States doesn't have anything like this. Maybe you have something like that in Latvia, but I think it is a really smart idea. So a place where the United States can learn from you, and I think we have some lessons that we can share as well. Diplomatically. As I said, I think we have a strong alliance, 60% of global GDP of all the democracies working together. I see kind of three major blocks emerging in the current international system. We do have the free world, and I think we're showing remarkable unity in response to Russia's invasion. And then we have these revisionist autocracies, Russia, China, Iran, working more closely together. But then third, there's something like a new non-aligned movement. We have seen some of these major powers, India, South Africa, Brazil, not wanting to take a side in this dispute. And I've been disappointed by that. I expected India and others to come to defend democracies against Russia, but that's not what they've done. And so I think that should be one of our goals, to try to get some of these other powers on our side and not let them about Russian and Chinese aggression. And then finally, military, and this is real important. I think what we see now is that Russia thought it spotted weakness in Ukraine and decided to attack. I'm afraid that China might make a similar miscalculation in Taiwan. Always the danger that Russia could make a similar miscalculation against other countries in Eastern Europe, including against NATO allies. So I think what we need to do is have a military strategy where we're so strong that Russia and China decide not to attack us. I think we need a favorable balance of power. And we have a pretty good military strategy now, but I think after Ukraine, we do need to strengthen it. And NATO is currently working on a new strategic concept. It will be released later this year. What I'm advocating, what many other experts are advocating for, is a heavier forward deployment of forces, US and NATO forces in Eastern Europe, to make it clear to Putin that invading a NATO country would be a big fight, and a big fight that he would lose. Major challenge ahead of us, but I think pursuing a strategy like this with free world democratic countries working together, that we can prevail. So there's much more I could say. It's a huge topic, but I do want to save time for Q&A and discussion. So let me end my lecture there and look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much. While students are thinking about their questions, I have a question regarding US policy, so foreign policy. So as we know, John Mearsheimer has criticized a lot West regarding situation in Ukraine. He has expressed again that partly it's West's fault on what is happening. On another hand, Mearsheimer is the one who has always standed for selective engagement. Offshore balancing. So what is your opinion on his ideas, and how would you comment? Because basically what we see, that there is this big question, if United States stay in Europe in order to support Ukraine, will be there enough attention paid to East, to China, and what China is doing in the region?
Yes, good questions. So first, Professor Mearsheimer, I think he's wrong, and I think almost everybody in Washington thinks he's wrong. And so that's why he's getting so much attention, because he's saying things that everybody disagrees with, and it makes them angry, and they argue back. He's very smart, but he's been a professor at the University of Chicago for many decades. He's never worked in Washington, and so I think he has a theory about how the world should work, and then the world works differently, and so it confuses him. And so instead of adjusting his theory to actually explain the world, he criticizes the real world and says, no, America's doing it wrong, you're not following my theory. But that's not what a real political scientist should do. A real political scientist should explain the world, not criticize it. And if you actually look at US, and I'm working on a new book now, really on US grand strategy since 1945, and I think actually the United States has had a pretty consistent grand strategy since 1945, and it has been about protecting important geopolitical regions with its military, promoting democracy, promoting open markets, and so that is what the United States is doing in Eastern Europe right now. I think it is in the U.S. interest, and I think there is a bipartisan consensus in Washington that it is in America's interest to remain engaged in Eastern Europe. So in short, I think Mearsheimer is wrong. Now, there are some people in Washington who are becoming more isolationist. Why are we protecting Europe? But I do think it's a minority, and I think there still is a bipartisan consensus that American engagement in the world is good for the world and good for the United States. Because after all, if the United States withdraws, other actors like Russia and China are going to fill the vacuum in ways that are counter to our interests. Can the United States deal with Russia and China at the same time? This is another debate. in Washington right now. So you have some in the so-called Asia First school who say, well, China is the bigger long-term threat. So really we need to be focused there. And so we can't get too bogged down in Europe. The European countries are going to have to do more. I think that's wrong. And I had an article in Foreign Policy magazine a few, I guess 6 weeks or so ago now, that got a lot of attention. It got a lot of attention in part because the editors chose a very provocative headline that I wouldn't have selected. The headline was, "Washington needs to prepare for war with Russia and China." But you know, what the article said is that we and our allies need to have a plan to deter both Russia and China, so we don't go to war. And so I think we can do that. And I think there are three pieces to the strategy. You know, one, I think the United States needs to increase defense spending. So right now, the United States is spending about 3% of its GDP on defense. During the Cold War, it spent 7% of its GDP on defense on average. So if we're entering two new Cold Wars with Russia and China, I think we do need to increase. And in fact, the Biden administration did ask for a large increase to the defense budget in the most recent year. The second piece, though, is I do think allies need to do more. Now, you know, some like Latvia have been meeting your defense spending requirements. Others like Germany haven't. And so I have been encouraged in recent weeks as Germany, Poland, Romania, other countries have decided to increase their spending. I think the allies are going to have to help. You know, we don't get the advantage of the full 60% of GDP if not all the allies are contributing. And then third, I do think US nuclear deterrence is an important part of the equation. You know, Russia and China clearly think nuclear weapons are important. We see Russia's nuclear threats. We see China's massive nuclear buildup. And so I think the United States maintaining a strong nuclear deterrent as well to counter that is important. And in fact, there is bipartisan consensus for the United States to modernize its nuclear arsenal. So I think we can deal with them both, but we need Latvia and our other friends to help.
Thank you very much for your response. We have a question from Anton's. He has written it in chat. So he has a question regarding possible Russian-Chinese Commonwealth. Do you think it is possible as a reaction to Western unity against authoritarian regimes around the world?
Yes, well, good question. And I think it depends on what you mean by Commonwealth, because I do think that Russia and China are already working more closely together. Again, joint military exercises, some major economic agreements with Russia selling energy to China, joint weapons production, and then, you know, the diplomatic support, China basically backing Putin's war in Ukraine. So I do think they're going to work more closely together, and that's going to be a challenge. Some have said, well, let's try to split them apart. Let's maybe cooperate with Russia against China or cooperate with China against Russia. I don't think that will work. I don't think Russia or China want to cooperate with the West. So unfortunately, I do think we're going to have to deal with them both. But there are also limits to their cooperation. You know, dictators don't make good allies. They've turned on each other before during the Cold War. So they could always turn on each other again. And so, Antons, I don't know what you mean by a commonwealth, but, you know, I don't think they're going to form a deep, trusting alliance like we have with NATO. I think it's a marriage of convenience for now, but it is a dangerous one. And so why are they working together? I think they do have, you know, because the other part of the question was, is it a reaction to our unity? And I think basically that, you know, this rules-based international system that leading democracies have developed, I think Russia and China see that as a threat. They're both threatened by the spread of democracy. They're threatened by these democratic alliances on their border. You know, they want to have a sphere of influence where they can rule as they see fit. And so I think they do have this shared interest in working together against us. But we've dealt with, you know, autocratic challengers in the past, like Nazi Germany, Soviet Union. And so I think we can prevail against these autocratic challengers this time around.
Thank you. But here, I guess I have an additional question before I will give floor to Daniela. So do you really see that China is kind of backing Russia now in the context of Ukrainian conflict? Okay, we can consider Security Council, but in other ways, is this really the situation we can observe, or what are the indications of this type of backing from side of China?
Yes, well, first, China did make this statement before the invasion that there are no limits in the partnership. But I do think that China is in a difficult spot. I think that, like Russia, China probably thought this was going to be easy, that Russia was going to go in within a few days, they would be under control, and then the rest of the world would go back to normal business. So I think China has been surprised by this as well. And China's in a difficult spot because I think it does want to support Russia. I think it wants Russia to be strong and to be able to threaten Europe. If the United States has to deal with a strong Russia in Europe, then China has a freer hand in Asia. But I think that China also has significant economic ties in Europe, significant diplomatic ties. So I think it now is in a tight spot. It doesn't want to be seen as too directly supporting Russia. And so what it has said is that it's neutral, that it's neutral. But I don't see how you can really be neutral given this fight. One country was the victim, the other one was clearly the aggressor. And so I think the fact that China is saying it's neutral, not supporting Security Council resolutions against Russia, essentially it is facilitating Russia's aggression.
Thank you. And now question comes from Daniel. Daniel, please.
Yep, thank you for your lecture. It was really interesting. I would like to return to the point when you said that United States is spending approximately 3% on their defense, which is, and you mentioned that you think the Biden administration should increase the spending, which is understandable. But I'm just thinking, isn't it a great risk that Donald Trump might get back in power because Biden takes back the money from the citizens to increase the spending? That's for my first question.
Well, a couple of thoughts. One, Trump was actually in favor of defense spending. So he did talk about peace through strength. This was a term that Ronald Reagan first came up with, but basically the idea is that when the United States military is strong, that's when the world is peaceful because nobody wants to mess with us. And Trump often bragged about his military investments. He was going to have a nuclear weapons at the top of the pack. So I don't think defense spending is going to be something that's going to be controversial or that's going to lead Trump to become popular. In fact, I'd say the biggest resistance to defense spending on the U.S. political spectrum is probably on the left wing of the Democratic Party, the more progressive part of the party, who says, well, we should be spending on schools and hospitals, not in the United States, not on militaries. That said, that there is a risk that Trump could win the election. He's still the most popular Republican president right now. The U.S. economy, most popular Republican politician. The U.S. economy is not doing well currently, so voters might think they want to change from Biden. So I think that is a possibility. But I think you said you had another question.
Yep. My other question was related to China and Taiwan, as well as Russia and Ukraine. So you mentioned that there's a great risk that China and Russia might do something at the same time, which would maybe confuse United States of America and their allies. And I was just wondering, we live in such an anarchic like world system right now with the allies. Isn't that a great risk that just Russia and China are going to be much more prepared than we are, and that's why they could gain power over us?
Well, yeah, I guess could I ask what do you mean? Why do you think they would be more prepared? Just to make sure I'm answering your question.
Yeah, it's okay. So I wanted to specify before as well, but because for example, you mentioned that before Russia and China, before the Ukraine war, they mentioned already that their economic alliance is going to be so strong, so powerful. That means that they were already they had plans to invade Ukraine, and that they had worked together, and that China was informed by these plans somehow. So I was just thinking that maybe if they make a really thoughtful strategy to invade, I don't know if it's going to be Ukraine, Baltic states, Europe, and Taiwan at the same time, then maybe they're just prepared and we are not. And could that be an issue, or would you say that the West is also really ready for something that would happen simultaneously?
Yeah, good question. So a couple things I'd say. One, again, if we work together, we're stronger than Russia and China. So we have that advantage, but we have to work together. Two, I would say I think we're not quite prepared yet. So I talked about this NATO strategic concept. I think our current force posture in Eastern Europe is insufficient for an effective deterrent and defense. And so I'm hoping that with this NATO strategic concept, I'm predicting that we'll see more reinforcements in Eastern Europe. And in fact, we have seen some already since the conflict started. That's there. And then also in Asia, I think we're not where we need to be. I think we do need to have a better defense strategy for Taiwan. I think Taiwan needs to do more to defend itself. Imagine if the weapons we gave to Ukraine since February, if we had done that last fall, and Russia had seen the Stinger missiles and the javelins coming in, I think Russia would have said, okay, this is going to be too hard of a fight. And so I think we should learn that lesson and similarly arm other vulnerable countries so that they could deter a Chinese invasion, a Russian invasion. So I think we're not where we need to be now, but people like me, like you now, are awakening to this challenge. And so I think that's the task ahead, is to design the defense strategy and the force posture that could defeat Russia and China to deter both Xi and Putin.
Thank you. And we have also a question from Victoria Vildiņa. She's asking, how can large democracies persuade small democracies to abandon cooperation with China and Russia, given that relations would be detrimental to the small democracies' economies?
Good question. So I'd say a few things. One, the economic decoupling that I think is already happening and should continue is costly even for large economies. Germany didn't want to, is one of the largest economies on earth, and it didn't want to take the hard steps involved with decoupling from Russia. So I think it is costly for everyone. Second thing I would say is, what is more costly, taking the economic hit or being economically dependent on dangerous dictators? And I think, having your economy, your economic well-being depend on Putin or depend on Xi, I think we've seen is just too dangerous. So there's the security argument. The third thing I would say is that I do think that the free world needs to work together to offset the losses. And so there's been this idea of ally shoring, that, as we remove supply chains from Russia and China, if we don't want to produce, technologies in China anymore, where do we move them to? well, let's move them to allies that we trust, other democracies. And so, actually, democracies can benefit, some of the smaller democracies can benefit from changing those supply chains. Similar with Russian energy. If we don't buy energy from Russia anymore, where can we get it? Well, the United States is a major oil and gas exporter. So by actually reorienting our trade away from dangerous autocracies toward countries that we trust, there would be economic costs, but also economic benefits.
I see that we have one more question from Daniela. Daniela, please.
Yeah, but I'll need your help, sir, because there's a thing. I don't remember from the theoretical framework. I just don't remember how it was called, but it was also about the defense system. And I would just like to jump back to the last question when you said that we could, for example, increase Taiwan's defense system. We could increase the small democracies' defense system. And I remember that in the theory, it said that if we continuously increase the defense, the other country, the aggressor, might increase it also. So isn't it a risk of just like escalating an even bigger war ahead of us? If my professor could tell me the name of theory, if maybe that would help.
I think you meant security dilemma, but I'm not sure that we can apply that. It's so easy to this case, but still.
Yes. So it sounds like you're a professor, and I agree. So yes, there is the security dilemma. There are two models of arms racing. There's the spiral model and the deterrence model. Robert Jervis, a professor at Columbia University, wrote about this. So he said if you're in the spiral model, one country builds up its defenses, it makes the other country feel vulnerable, so it builds up its defenses, the first country feels vulnerable, and so you get into this arms race where both countries feel threatened, they're spending a lot on defense, and so you're basically creating tensions, for no reason. The other model is the deterrence model, and so that's a model where let me go back. In the spiral model, the assumption is both countries are just nice countries that want security, and by trying to get more security, they're threatening each other. The deterrence model says, well, what if there's an aggressive country? Well, then, if you don't have adequate defenses, the aggressive country will attack. And so you need to build up your defenses, and then maybe the adversary will build up, but if you don't build up, he'll attack, so you need to build up. And that actually arms racing can actually be a good thing in that model because it substitutes for war. And so what Professor Jervis argues is that the key then is figuring out which model are you in. Is your adversary just a nice security-seeking state and you're threatening it for no reason? Or is it an aggressive state and you need to build up to deter? So I think when we look at the situation in Russia, to me, it's pretty clear we're dealing with an aggressive state. We're in the deterrence model. And so we need to deter or else be attacked. But it's many of the policy debates in Washington, maybe in Riga as well. I feel like people have either the spiral model or the deterrence model in mind, but they're not explicit about it. But I think we are in the deterrence model here.
Thank you very much. We have one more question from Krish. Krish is asking, how significant to the global security is the China Solomon Island security pact?
Yes, so for those who aren't following, China has just signed a security deal with the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. The United States just sent a high-level delegation there to try to talk them out of it. So I'd say it's not the most important issue in the world, but it is significant. If Solomon Islands and China become security partners, Solomon Islands is close to Australia, so that's a threat to Australia. Australia is a U.S. ally, so we want to protect our allies. But also, I think it's concerning because it shows that China is trying to gain this global power projection capability to gain overseas bases where it can send naval ships. And so, it's the Solomon Islands. It was Djibouti a couple of years ago, Solomon Islands today. What's next? And so I do think that we have an interest in preventing China from developing a global power projection capability.
Thank you. And here is one more question, which is 1 million question here in Latvia, and I'm not sure that it is closely related to geopolitics, but still, I guess I must ask. Professor, do you have any opinion on what should be communication strategy of Latvian government and NGOs to reach and influence supporters of Putin in Latvia? I would say supporters of Putin globally then.
Well, it's a good question, and for Russia supporters in Latvia, you probably have the local knowledge and context better than I would. More broadly, I would say I think our biggest advantage is that we can tell the truth. Putin has to lie to his supporters to maintain their support. These lies about how the Ukrainians are Nazis and about how he hasn't called up reservists, and this is just a special military operation, not a war. And so I think the biggest thing we can do is just tell the truth, have a vibrant, free media where we present them with what's really happening. And the Putin supporters in Latvia better than I do, but I think that when people are presented with the horrors in Bucha and the war crimes permitted there, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, Ukraine's heroic existence. I mean, this to me seems like about as clear a case of good versus evil as we've had in international politics in some time. And so I think that reasonable people confronted with the truth will come to the right conclusion.
Okay, I will have the final question, and now I see that we are using your time already. So my question is, how do you see the future of Russia? Because this is another 1 million question, I guess, at the moment, because it seems that Ukraine will influence it a lot, but what would be your predictions regarding the future of Russia?
It's an important question, especially for a strategy. You want a good strategy not to last for a day, but to work. So unfortunately, I think that the Russia we see today is probably the Russia we'll be dealing with for the foreseeable future. Even if Putin were to have a heart attack tonight, my best guess is that somebody close to Putin who sees the world in a similar way would take over. But and this goes back to the goals of the strategy. My hope would be, though, that younger generations of Russians will be learning from this experience and say, well, this war in Ukraine didn't really help Russia very much. We're losing a lot of people, we're losing a lot of money, the world's balancing against us. And so, I hope they're looking at their economy and saying, well, Putin's getting rich, oligarchs around him are getting rich, but how is the average Russian doing? This kleptocratic economy doesn't really seem to be working for us. The free world is seizing our assets. It's harder for us to travel. So my hope would be that maybe a generation from now, maybe two, we'd have a new generation of Russian leaders who look back and say, the Putin strategy wasn't good for Russia. Wasn't good for me. We need a new approach. So I don't think we have to compete with Russia forever. I hope there could be a more cooperative relationship, but I do think we need to confront and compete now in order to cooperate in the future.
Thank you so much for your answer. Let's really hope for changes in Russia and the next generations. Thank you once more for giving this amazing, very interesting lecture. And thanks, students, for joining us on Friday afternoon. And hope, Professor, to see you soon in Latvia and to discuss issues regarding Russian speakers and other no less important regional and global issues. Thank you very much to all of you for joining today.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.